I'll do my best to try and unravel some of the mysteries. I'm actually in Spring Hill right now. I've lived in the area for about 15 or 16 years, but I'm right on the battlefield. I'm at Rippavilla right now, which the Battle of Franklin Trust just began managing about 3 weeks ago. And so it's kind of ironic that our daily work now encompasses the part of the story in the Tennessee campaign that I think and have always thought is as crucial to understanding what happened at Franklin as anything. So when I started researching and writing 25 years ago, there were a lot of mysteries, and I guess there still are. I mean, some things we'll probably never fully understand. But at that time, there were only a couple of really substantive books on the Battle of Franklin or the campaign as a whole. 5 Tragic Hours had come out in the early 1980s, and then Wiley Sword's book, Embrace an Angry Wind, which was later reprinted as The Confederacy's Last Hurrah, was really kind of the standard bearer of work on the campaign. And the first thing that struck me about Sword's work, I mean, he was a great writer, but he had this incredible, in my opinion, anti-Hood bias, but he also really focused a tremendous amount on the Confederate perspective. Now, he, of course, delved into the federal or the U.S. side of things, but there seemed to be a sort of uber focus on what the Confederates did not do versus what the U.S. Army did. And so I started traveling. And I was raised in Minnesota, so I was raised I mean, I'm almost Canadian. I'm from so far north, but I lived in Arizona for a long time. And it was when I lived in Arizona that I began to travel to Tennessee. And I was actually shocked at the sort of casual day-to-day interpretation at historic sites, what people who worked at, local archives and things that they said. And I zeroed in on Spring Hill and Hood in particular, which is a lot of what Wiley Sword did, but then I began to uncover other things. And what struck me about Hood, for example, was it was as if the officer in person that was being discussed in 1864 wasn't even the same guy who'd been in Virginia in 62 and 63. So long story short, there were lots of myths, more so than mysteries. There were myths about Spring. And I'll say straight out, one of the early things that I combated, and I chased this, dare I say, ghost for years, was that Hood was, on laudanum. He was addicted to morphine or drugs or something. There's no evidence of that. It's completely unfounded. And it always has been. The other thing that Sword pounded away on was that Hood was, in love with Sally Preston, and that clouded his judgment. Well, there's no evidence of that either. I mean, clearly he had some sort of relationship with Sally Preston, but I don't think Hood was thinking about his girlfriend or fiance or wife any more than anyone else was. And then the other part was that because Hood had been wounded, his left arm was useless, which it wasn't. He'd largely recovered from that injury within about 6 or 8 weeks after Gettysburg. And he had certainly lost his right leg, but that Hood was in agony and he was just, in terrible pain. Again, there's no evidence of that either. Hood actually had a remarkable recovery from his injury. And maybe the last one is that Hood was just an idiot. Well, I never found any evidence that Hood was an idiot. He certainly probably never should have been an army commander. But that brings us to 1864. And I argued 20 years ago, and I would still argue today, that there just weren't a lot of other good choices for Jefferson Davis in the summer of 1864 when he opted to replace Joseph Johnston, who, for a moment of levity, I've never understood the love affair with Joe Johnston, because he's just like George McClellan in a different uniform, where he has an army, but he doesn't really like to use it a lot. Well, Hood came out of the Lee and Jackson School of Warfare, which was to get after the enemy. And Davis was desperate to find someone who would at least fight for Atlanta. And there weren't a lot of other choices. You were never going to put Nathan Bedford Forrest in charge of the army. Pat Claiborne had never been a corps commander. And, a lot of the others had been trying. So Hood gets the job. with all due respect, I don't think anyone was going to stop Sherman from capturing Atlanta. It was a nearly impossible task. So Sherman captures Atlanta, and that gets us to where we are in late 64. Without delving into things like Juneteenth and emancipation, I think it goes without saying, however, that by the fall of 1864, the Civil War had changed dramatically. The body count was continuing to escalate. So the violence was spiraling into a place that, I mean, no one had anticipated this. You know, the Overland campaign, the Atlanta campaign were just shocking. The numbers. I mean, this is like World War I casualties. It's just stunning people. They couldn't believe they'd gotten into this. But the scope of the war had changed. The Emancipation Proclamation materially changed the war. It put a moral equation, it infused a moral equation into the military dynamics. You know, black men were now enlisting by the tens of thousands to fight for the U.S. Army. And Confederate soldiers, Confederate officers, Confederate politicians, Southern civilians, they all knew this. They knew that this was a fight for extermination or victory. And when I say extermination, I don't literally mean, you know, that everyone who's alive is going to be gone, but the entire Southern way of life is going to be exterminated if they lose the war. And the entire Southern way of life, whether you own slaves or not, was built on the racial hierarchy of black people being inferior to white people and slavery. And so then that gets us to why there's a campaign. So Hood lost Atlanta. Hood and Davis consulted shortly after the fall of Atlanta, and I would argue accurately gauged there was nothing to be gained by chasing Sherman around wherever he was going to go next. Nipping at his heels or his flanks wasn't going to accomplish a doggone thing. So in the back of their minds, and in the back of a lot of people's minds, there'd always been this idea that maybe they could retake Middle Tennessee. Maybe they could retake Nashville. And Nashville had been this lost jewel, had been lost early in the war. And that's really the genesis of the campaign. So Hood, you know, he tries to draw Sherman out into a fight, but Sherman's not going to. Sherman had no interest in really playing around with Hood anymore. And so this goes on for a couple of weeks, but eventually Sherman cuts loose, moves back with the bulk of his forces initially to Rome and then to Atlanta. And Hood breaks loose and cuts west across Alabama, intending to cross the Tennessee River and move up into the heartland, into Middle Tennessee. And he still had about 28,000 infantry, gets about 5,000 cavalry. So he's it's a weakened, smaller army, but it's still very powerful. And Abraham Lincoln and U.S. Grant, of course, now being in charge of all U.S. forces, they were concerned about Hood. You know, they wanted Sherman to deal with Hood. Sherman pitched this idea of a march. They finally acquiesced, but under one condition. Sherman had to ship troops back to Tennessee to deal with Hood. So he sends George Henry Thomas back. But the main point is that he sent John Schofield back in command of the 4th and the 23rd U.S. Army Corps. And Schofield takes command. He is in Middle Tennessee by mid-November, and Hood is poised to cross the Tennessee River, which he did on the 21st. And as we describe it every day in our interpretation, this is the last great campaign of the war. This is it. This is the last big push. This is the last big threat. And you've got a Confederate army on the loose. And the newspapers are picking up on this. You know, Northern newspapers, they'd grown tired of the kind of war of attrition in Virginia. All of a sudden, Sherman disappears. On November 15th, he cuts the lines and he's moving across Georgia. So nobody really knows what he's up to. So magazines like the Chicago Tribune and the Cincinnati Daily Enquirer and the New York Times, they're all over this campaign in Tennessee as best they can. Because now all of a sudden Hood is back up into Middle Tennessee, where there haven't been Confederate troops since basically the first days of 1863. So what Hood's trying to do is not just retake Nashville. He knows he has to try and deal the U.S. Army, Schofield's force, a lethal blow, or else he has no chance of taking Nashville, no realistic chance. And let's be honest, his chances of taking Nashville were were slim anyways, but you couldn't employ defensive strategy. It's not what Davis wanted. Hood didn't believe sitting around playing defense was going to accomplish anything. And dare I say, this is a moment when I think hindsight actually is completely 2020. He was right. If you were going to play defense, you might as well just surrender. So he goes on the offense and he pushes hard. He comes out of Alabama. Schofield is aware he's there. His cavalry is doing a pretty good job providing reconnaissance and intel. But Hood's moving fast. He's got 3 Army Corps plus Forrest Cavalry Corps. And he comes close to cutting Schofield off before he can get to Columbia. Schofield initially was in Pulaski, which, to give you some geographic idea, it's about 60 miles south of Franklin. So, what's that, 90 kilometers? He comes close, but Schofield gets into Columbia. And this is where the Spring Hill situation really begins to take shape. Hood believes that he still has a chance to effectively outflank Schofield's forces. And so he creates on paper what I have said for years is it's a bold plan. It makes sense. And it's very daring. It's very Lee and Jackson. Split your force, create a diversion, try and get behind the enemy, cause all sorts of chaos. So he opts to leave basically 2/3 of the division, the bulk of his artillery in Columbia, while he swings roughly 20,000 of his infantry east of Columbia, hoping to interpose himself between Franklin and Columbia, firmly behind Schofield. And what's in between Franklin and Columbia? At that time, a little village known as Spring Hill. And so the movement begins really on the 28th of November. Forrest helps push the Federal cavalry away far enough to open up an opportunity for the infantry. And so Schofield on the morning of November 29th is really a bit blind. He's not really sure what Hood's up to. He does send out an infantry reconnaissance and does see infantry moving to the east, but he can clearly see infantry in front of him. And there's a hell of an artillery barrage going on, so he's not really sure what the threat is. Schofield makes a decision about mid-morning that day, which is really key, and I think was historically overlooked by writers. And this gets into my earlier point about how Wiley's sword focused almost reflexively on what Hood was doing and what Hood eventually was not able to do. John Schofield, although initially he reacts a little slowly, he reacts appropriately. He sends a division, George Wagner's division of 5,000 men, back, might be flanking, and he wanted to be able to hold that position. He wants to hold the midway point. And that turns out to be fortuitous because around noon, Forrest Cavalry, which again was screening the infantry movement, comes pounding down the road east of Spring Hill, and they run into this infantry. Now, don't forget this piece. Not only does Forrest run into Wagner's infantry, Forrest, and this is a mystery, and I don't think we'll ever know why, Forrest never figured out that he was actually facing not just infantry, he was facing massed infantry. So he's poking and probing at Wagner most of the, noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock hour, but he can't make any progress. So he finally pulls back. He waits for the infantry to arrive. So Schofield's still uncertain where the main threat's at. But at around 2:30, 3 o'clock, he's gotten word that there's a good bit of, musketry, the rattling of some artillery fire coming from Spring Hill. And he begins to think that what's in front of him actually is the diversion. So he begins to withdraw, and he pulls his first division out, which is Ruger's division. Not long after he makes that decision, Hood's infantry, 20,000, 2 full Army Corps, are arriving on the outskirts of Spring Hill. And Hood begins to deploy his troops. At the moment he deploys his infantry, Frank Cheatham's corps in the lead, Pat Claiborne's division first on the field, John Bell Hood has no intelligence of enemy infantry at Spring Hill because Forrest had never figured out what he was facing. And it's incredible. All these years later, I mean, having written about it, I have talked about this I mean, incessantly. When Pat Cleburne advanced around 3:45 p.m. that afternoon, fronting off of what was then the Rally Hill Pike and is today Kedron Road, he's 1.5 miles east of Columbia Pike. That's the objective. They're trying to block the road at or just south of Spring Hill. When Pat Cleburne advanced, he had no idea that barely 1/3 of a mile to his front right was Luther Bradley's brigade of almost 1,500 Federal infantry. He had no idea, and Forrest was on the field. And so within minutes, Cleburne's run into a virtual ambush, and all sorts of furious fighting breaks out between his right flank brigade, which is Mark Lowry's, and Bradley's. And so Cleburne's objective is right in front of him, but he's taking this furious fire on his right flank. And so he alters his route of march, and he turns to the right to deal with Bradley, who he just caves in Bradley. The 42nd Illinois lost probably 125 guys in just 5 or so minutes. Cleburne takes pushing Bradley's brigade back toward the town. And this is where everything starts to unravel. Frank Cheatham has moved his 2nd Division in on Cleburne's left flank, commanded by William Bate. William Bate has actually gotten to within about 150 or 200 yards of the road right around sundown. He's literally, 300 yards north of where I'm sitting right now. He can see the road. He can actually see it. And he gets an order to stop from Frank Cheatham, because Cheatham wants him to stop because he's also told Cleburne to stop, and he wants Bate to connect with Cleburne, who's veered off to the northeast, pursuing Bradley, who is now repositioned right outside the town, along with the other 2 brigades of Wagner's division, Emerson Updikes and John Lane. So they formed this tight defensive perimeter around the town. Well, Bate gets this order, and he's thinking, what? Why? Pull back. The road's right in front of me. But there's another problem. Bate his skirmishers have actually run into some enemy resistance on the road. Not a lot, but a handful of skirmishers. Well, Bate's confused, A, that he's been stopped, and B, he doesn't know why he's run into enemy troops on the road. Guess who he's run into? The skirmishers of Ruger's division. Ruger's division is coming up the road from the south. They're barely a half mile south of Rippavilla. And Ruger actually can see Bate in line of battle. Ruger's in column, and Schofield's with him. So Ruger pulls off the road to the west and forms into line of battle. Bate later reported that he learned this fact. He didn't know it at the time. Why he didn't know it is unclear. I think some of the buildings, including Rippavilla, may have blocked his line of sight. Ruger was just far enough south that he could see Bate's line of battle as it advanced toward the road. So Ruger stops. Bate stops. Cheatham orders Bate to pull back, which he does, and Ruger and Schofield can see Bate pulling. Think about this. He's pulling away from the road. He's moving away from his objective. And so Ruger and Schofield, they wait a bit, and then they start moving north. And they literally march right up the road into Spring Hill, where Wagner's at. Ruger then pushes on toward Thompson Station. But the whole Confederate fiasco is beginning to unfold. So Cheatham has three divisions. So he moves John Brown's division into place on Cleburne's right. So moving right to left, he's got Brown, Cleburne, and Bate. He tells Brown to advance. He tells Cleburne when you hear Brown's guns advance. Tells Bate the same thing. Brown never moves. He just sits there to the end of his life. And here's another mystery. I can't tell you exactly why he didn't move, but to the end of his life, Brown insisted he never got any other orders, because Brown said that he found Federal troops on his flank, and he did. John Lane could see Brown massing for an advance, and Lane moved a regiment out just to the east, and it spooked Brown. Well, how was Lane able to move troops out and basically cause concern to Brown? Forrest had pulled his cavalry back. Forrest had pulled his entire cavalry corps away from the action without any orders. And so Brown just sits there. Cheatham, to the end of his life, insisted that he had told Brown to advance. So somewhere between the two of them, somebody's either not telling the truth or forgot what actually happened. During the course of my research, I found a document that I think was one of the linchpins of understanding what didn't happen at Spring Hill. It was written by a guy named Joseph Cumming. And if you've got my book, you can read what Cumming said. It was an unpublished memoir I found at UNC Chapel Hill. Cumming, because it was unpublished, wasn't in Confederate Veteran, never in a magazine, never in a newspaper, never in a book. He had no axe to grind. He was writing a memoir for his family. He said, he was one of these line officers that night that was, running. Got back to Hood's headquarters, and he found Cheatham remonstrating against the nighttime attack. Because remember, by this time, it's almost dark. And when I read the account, I thought, oh my God, he was remonstrating, which means to argue or forcefully argue. I think Cheatham, based on Cumming's account, was doing something not completely unexpected. Cheatham had already run into serious trouble. Cleburne's division had been mauled on its right flank. Cheatham had no idea that Ruger's division had just moved up the road. There was no intelligence. Cheatham was operating in a vacuum, and thus so was Hood. So Cheatham goes to Hood saying, I don't think we should do this. We shouldn't be stumbling around in the dark. We've already gotten into trouble. And remember, if you're familiar with Chickamauga, a year earlier, Cheatham and Cleburne had been involved in that terrible nighttime attack in which Preston Smith was killed. So it's not at all, I think, odd that Cheatham would be making this argument. And I think in principle, Hood agrees. There's no doubt Hood agrees because he said as much later on. But Hood wasn't done. Hood believed that if Cheatham's corps could not block the pike because they weren't certain exactly what they were facing, they might try and block the pike north of town. If you look at a map of Spring Hill, the Columbia Turnpike does not run due north and south. It runs almost northeast to southwest. So if you moved another column of troops due north, east of Spring Hill, you would cut the road north of town. And Hood has an entire other Army corps on the field, A.P. Stewart's corps. So he moves Stewart's corps early evening up back roads east of Spring Hill, and unbelievably, Stewart gets lost. He can't find the road. It's new moon that night. It is completely dark. He's unfamiliar with the terrain, and he could not find Columbia Pike. What he didn't know was he was within about 250 or 300 yards of it, and he bivouacked his men. He went to report this to Hood. He went with Nathan Bedford Forrest, who he found at the Caldwell house, and they woke Hood up, and they told him what was going on. Now, I want you to just take a moment and think about this. This is probably 9 or 10 o'clock at night. The commanding general, the cavalry commander, and one of the infantry commanders has no idea that the enemy's on the road. Because by this time, the other 3 divisions of Schofield's army are moving north. Jacob Cox, Nathan Kimball, and T.J. Wood. They've started to arrive on the outskirts of Spring Hill, and Cox's division's actually gotten to town. None of them have any information about the enemy being on the move. Hood is awoken at least 2 other times that night, once by William Bate and once by a private soldier. The first reliable intel that Hood got was from the private soldier, whose name we don't know, we'll never will, who had been straggling most of the day, and he was convinced there were enemy troops on the road. By the time they got around to investigating this soldier's claim, they'd missed the trail end of the last federal column. For about 5 or 6 hours, Schofield had moved the bulk of his army right up the road, right in front of the Confederate army, which was anywhere from 200 to 400 yards from the road. He moved over 20,000 men, 800 supply wagons, 60 pieces of artillery, and probably 6,000 or 7,000 horses and mules, right up the road into Spring Hill and then beyond it. George Wagner, who'd been the first into Spring Hill, did not withdraw until 5 a.m. He and his men kept that tight defensive perimeter around the town, and they pulled out just before sunup. There were stories so many years ago about John Bell Hood being enraged, that he met all the generals at Rippavilla, which he didn't. I think the only general he met at Rippavilla was Frank Cheatham, because Hood had been headquartered at a place called Oaklawn, which is about 1.25 miles east of where I'm at. And I think somewhere between Oaklawn and Rippavilla on the morning of November 30th, sun comes up about 6:30. So Hood's probably, on the move around dawn. And word had begun to spread as it started to get light that the enemy wasn't south of them any longer. The road was littered with debris right in front of them. And it was very clear that the enemy had gotten away. And I think when Hood got to Rippavilla and met with Cheatham, it wasn't so much whether he chewed Cheatham out or not, and he may have. It was the fact that they'd let the enemy army escape. Hood ordered an immediate pursuit, believing they had to get on Schofield's tail immediately. That if there was any chance to achieve anything in this campaign, to try and drag the war out, to try and not lose, to try and not let Southern independence just flame out, they had to catch Schofield. And, of course, as you all know, they did later that day, because Schofield didn't intend to stop in Franklin. He only stopped there because he couldn't get across the Harpeth River. Schofield knew when he got to Franklin early on November 30th. So he gets there around 4:30. Think about that. When Schofield gets to Franklin at 4:30 a.m., George Wagner hasn't left Spring Hill. That's how strung out Schofield's army was, even on November 30th. But when he got there, he knew he had to stay because he couldn't get across those bridges. And so, of course, he sets up this temporary defensive position, which Hood gets his first look at around 12:30 or 1 o'clock. I believed years ago when I started to do the research, you could not understand Franklin. You couldn't understand the ferocity. You couldn't understand why the Confederate soldiers literally just flung themselves at the U.S. works. And you couldn't understand why Hood made the decision he did. You couldn't understand why men like Pat Claiborne simply said, I will take the works or I will fall in the attempt. Or later on, he said, if we're going to die, let us die like men. This was the Army of Tennessee. They'd been at Shiloh. They'd been at Perryville and Murfreesboro and Chickamauga and Chattanooga and all around Atlanta. And a lot of the guys, especially in the Fourth Corps, had been there too. These two armies had a long track record. And, in, I think, some ways, the romantic views, especially that people in this country have of the war, I can't speak for, there was an age. I think that 1864 had become similar to 1944 and 1945 in World War II. It was a grinding, bloody, violent, nasty affair. And what happened at Franklin was not supposed to happen there. John Bell Hood intended the fight would be here in Spring Hill. But the enemy got away. And by God, when he got to Franklin, he wasn't going to let them get out of town without a fight. I have argued for years that what you see at Franklin, Tennessee, and I know this is 1863 is not 1864, but we, I think, sometimes forget that it's not that long, that the summer of away. When Robert E. Lee got to Gettysburg, he tried desperately on that first and second day, and he couldn't crack the U.S. troops. Meade and the guys in the First Corps and the Second Corps, they stood there, they took it. Lee hadn't gone up into Gettysburg or up into Pennsylvania to just back away. And everything that happens on that third day at Gettysburg is driven by what happened the first 2 days. He was not going to relinquish the initiative. John Bell Hood, yes, he's a West Point graduate. Yes, he's a young man. Yes, he had that aggressive DNA. But John Bell Hood came right out of that Lee School of Warfare. And John Bell Hood, when he got to Franklin, was not going to back down, was not going to give up the initiative. And everything that happens there is driven by what happened in Spring Hill on November 29th, 1864. And at this late date, 160 years, almost after it all happened, I don't know that there are really any mysteries At least there aren't for me. There's a few, things that we just won't know. But what happened at Spring Hill was human error. People make mistakes. We can sit around and we have all the information all these years later, and we've got the time to analyze it, talk about it, write about it, rewrite about it, reanalyze it, have meetings like this, and we'll discuss it at roundtable meetings. And they had no time. They were reacting at the moment. Of course, in hindsight, those who survived it wish it had not been the way that it ended up. But I think that for many Confederate veterans, they knew that Spring Hill, in many ways, seemed almost providential. One old soldier said, God just didn't want the war to go on anymore. For U.S. troops, they knew that they had been very fortunate and they'd worked their tail off to get away. And at Franklin, they helped end the war. And just a few months after this, it's why we call it the last great campaign of the war. Just a few months after this, it was finally over. The Battle of Franklin and the Battle of Spring Hill, they had to occur. They had to unfold the way that they did for the war to end the way that it did. And I've always felt that this ground, this place, the events here were key to understanding, I think, one of the most misunderstood battles of the American Civil War, and really one of the most misunderstood characters, which is John Bell Hood. And I think the last thing I'll say, and then I can certainly take some questions, is not enough credit is given to John Schofield, David Stanley, Jacob Cox, George Wagner, and 20,000 U.S. soldiers for pulling off the greatest escape of the American Civil War. There's literally nothing else like it. And it didn't happen just because the Confederates screwed up. It happened because they took advantage of the initiative given to them, and they wrested it right out of the Confederates' hands. And they got to Franklin and they prepared, and then they laid waste to the Army of Tennessee. And then, as I said, a few months later, it was finally over.